Albert gets $8 allowance each week. His friend Dwayne gets $16 allowance each week. Last week, Albert spent 5/8 of his allowance while Dwayne spent 3/8 of his allowance. We're going to answer two questions here. Number one, which boy spent the larger fractional portion of his allowance? And number two, which boy spent more money? Now let's start out by getting our information organized. Albert, I'll underline in blue, Albert gets $8 allowance. And we know that Albert spent 5/8 of his allowance. I'll circle that in blue. Dwayne, I'll underline in red. Dwayne gets a $16 allowance. And Dwayne spent 3/8 of his allowance. So I'll use red circles for the Dwayne information. Now the first question is pretty easy to answer here. Which boy spent the larger fractional portion of his allowance? We know Albert spent 5/8. Dwayne spent 3/8. 5/8 is more than 3/8. So Albert spent the larger fractional portion. Because 5/8 is more than 3/8. Now for the second question, which boy spent more money, we need to actually figure out how much money they spent. I have two envelopes in my hand. Each contains the allowance for one of the boys. This envelope has Dwayne's $16 allowance, and this envelope has Albert's $8 allowance. Now let's figure out exactly how much money each of the two boys has spent. First, we're going to look at Albert's allowance. Now inside, there should be $8. Let's check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, $8 is his weekly allowance. We want to separate this allowance into 8 equal parts. Well, if I place these dollars down separately, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, I can see that each dollar is exactly one of 8 equal parts of his allowance. So each dollar is 1/8 of his allowance. Now we know that Albert spent 5/8 of his allowance. So if I take 1/8 plus another is 2/8 plus another is 3/8 plus another is 4/8 plus another is 5/8, 5/8 of Albert's allowance is the same as this $5 amount. We know Albert spent $5. Now I'm going to hang on to the $5, put the remaining $3 in the envelope that he has left, and we'll set this on the side. Let's take a look at Dwayne's allowance now. Dwayne's allowance is $16. Let's just check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, $16, sure enough. Now let's separate Dwayne's allowance into 8 equal parts so we can think about how much each eighth would be. To do that, I'm going to create 8 stacks of dollar bills again. I start out with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then I go back to distributing the dollars right on top of the ones I already have. So here's another, 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 and another. And it comes out very nicely. Because I had $16, I was able to create 8 stacks with $2 in each stack. Now I've separated Dwayne's allowance into 8 equal parts. One of those parts consists of $2. So for Dwayne, $2 is 1/8 of his allowance. We need to figure out how much 3/8 of Dwayne's allowance is. Well, here's 1/8, a 2/8, that's 2/8, plus a 3/8, that's 3/8. So here we have 3/8 of Dwayne's allowance. That's how much he spent. The rest I'll put back in the envelope. And the 3/8 that I picked up, those 3 stacks of 2, is $1, 2, 3, 4, 5, $6. So we know that Dwayne spent $6, while Albert spent $5 of his allowance. Now let's go back to the whiteboard. Now let's figure out how much each boy spent without counting dollar bills, but by working with the fractions. First, let's look at Albert. We know that Albert spent $5/8 of his allowance, and Albert's allowance was $8. Albert spent 5/8 of $8. When we want to find a fraction of a quantity, we can take that fraction, in this case 5/8, times that quantity, times the whole number 8, representing the $8. Because I'm taking a fraction times a whole number, I'll write that whole number over 1. So I'm calculating 5/8 times 8 over 1. If I think of this as a fraction multiplication problem, I can cancel 8s above and below, and I'm left with just 5 over 1, which is $5. That's the $5 that Albert spent. Now let's go ahead and look at how much Dwayne spent. Dwayne spent, let's see back here, Dwayne is in red, he spent 3/8 of his allowance, and Dwayne's allowance was $16. Again, because we're taking a fraction of a quantity, we can write this as the fraction times that quantity, 3/8 times 16, or 16 over 1, since 16 is a whole number. Now let's go ahead and do the fraction multiplication here. Now I can do some canceling here. In fact, because 8 goes into 16 2 times, I'm just going to recopy the 3/8. I won't break down the 8. The 16 I'm going to rewrite as 2 times 8. I will break that down. I can see that I'm going to be able to cancel that 8. So I'll go ahead and cancel. And I'm left with 3 times 2 up above. That's 6 over 1 below. 6 over 1 is $6. So there we calculated with fractions that Dwayne spent $6. Dwayne actually spent more than Albert spent. Now let's just sum up our results back in the original problem. So we now have our answer to the second question, which boy spent more money? In fact, we calculated it 2 different ways. We used dollar bills, and we also figured it out using fractions. We now know that Dwayne spent more money. We know that Dwayne spent $6. And $6 is more than $5. $5 is how much Albert spent. It's interesting to notice that while Albert spent the larger fractional portion of his income, Dwayne actually spent more money.